Anime can be a lot of things to a lot of people. But for those of us outside Japan, it's also a window into the culture that inspired the artistry itself. By this logic, many of the deviations from what was originally presented might be seen as unnecessary at best, or a form of censorship at worst. Regardless of the subject matter, fans may feel there's no need for changing anything, because doing so would be insulting to the integrity of the original creators, and in some cases, the background they drew upon. Unfortunately, even we can't blame people for feeling this way. Anime dubbing has had an image to contend with, and at one point in time, that image looked like this.
Oh dear, I'm afraid you're about to enter into a world of pain, a world of chaos, a world of absolute mayhem. That's right, a world of toons!
There was a time when it wasn't exactly uncommon for anime to be hack dubs. This informal term refers to dubs that did a bit more than just dubbing.
We grew up together. Huh?
Of course, the script and tone would be drastically different, but in some cases, so would the assets, the music, or even the editing of the shots.
You know, become friends.
Content was being altered or flat out removed, either for the sake of broadcast standards, or having anime pass as American cartoons, which already had proven audiences. Obviously, not everything in years past were hack dubs, and not all hack dubs performed equally well. But their ubiquity set an unfortunate precedent for what localization meant. The original identities of these anime were fundamentally spliced. The unbutchered Japanese episodes fell to the wayside, often being kept out of official Western distribution for years, while these censored versions would be paraded around as original content, sometimes to monstrous success. If this was your only exposure to Japanese animation, it'd be understandable to view it as something incapable of mature or versatile storytelling, especially since some companies would only try popularizing certain kinds of properties in the first place. It was a pretty unfair stigma, both to the shows themselves and the people who did appreciate the wider scope of the medium. But how have things changed over the past 2 decades? There are still a few titles that get heavily modified for the sake of children's entertainment, but it's pretty clear that anime can be internationally celebrated without being hacked up and put back together. Over time, more and more English speakers have been made aware of Japanese culture, since many of the filters that dictate the content we would and wouldn't receive from Japan have faded. Hell, even high-profile Western productions have seriously started taking cues from the appeal of certain anime. By reaching audiences via streaming instead of cable television, the new norm for consuming anime is subtitled and week to week as it airs, so avoiding the medium's Japanese roots has become impossible. US broadcast standards mostly no longer apply, and the market for appreciation has evolved beyond just selling toys. Older classics have been redubbed to better honor the spirit of the original property, and some companies like Aniplex have even started supervising the dubs of their own shows. With all these measures and new standards in place, one might assume that anime dubbing would no longer be synonymous with censorship or a lack of cultural sensitivity. Incidents like Aniplex of America censoring that episode of SAO Alicization even demonstrate how it can happen before the dubbed version anyway. Pushing to mitigate stuff like cut content, obscured visuals, and replaced music is as straightforward as just saying, don't do it. However, adapting dialogue from one language to another remains a grey area, where even noble attempts won't satisfy everyone, and some potential for censorship still exists.
God bless America! Land of free speech!
Ghost Stories is not a dub often brought up to argue the faults of censorship, but dubs like it are proof that you don't need to edit a show to distort its narrative. ADR can accomplish enough on its own despite the limitations.
You gotta be like Cameron Diaz in the paparazzi! Bang!
The level of ambiguity that generically shaped lip flaps provide is something that was also abused during the era of hack dubs, and even though the intent behind it has changed for the most part, the possibility is still there. Censorship is often associated with the omission of content, but the act of imposing one set of standards over another is a more broadly applicable definition. Whether it was an ignorant mistake, or whether there was some kind of agenda behind it, it's the feeling that us fans are missing out on something. The feeling that the Western side is watering down or wilting the original intent in this unedited manner. We covered some of these examples in our video, Why Do Anime Dubs Change the Original Script? A video that has since been age restricted by YouTube, ironically considering this video's title. Although maybe that's a good thing, as some of the points there could have been made more fairly. Because while cases like these don't represent the majority of what happens nowadays, if unchecked they can change the tone of a scene, entire character personalities, how they respond to certain events, or even imply new off-screen antics.
I feel like we've struggled for so long to, have serious, legitimate dubs for everything that comes out. There's that part of me that's like, oh boy, I grew up in the 90s and 2000s. I remember how long it took us to get here. Can we not take a step back?
However, the difference between general mistakes and censorship is that the latter is deliberate in some capacity. And since creative decisions in general are deliberate, it's possible for some people to consider one as the other. Just because a certain writing decision wasn't intended to be censorship, doesn't mean some viewers won't interpret it that way. Now that there's a large Western audience that doesn't want their anime to be sanitized, the dilemma has shifted away from how do we target media towards an audience it technically wasn't designed to target, and more so towards how do we make it seem like the people who made this show or movie were bilingual all along. That latter idea is at least how Sentai Filmworks translator Jake Young described his approach to me, and honestly it sounds like a very concise representation of what localization should accomplish nowadays. If they were bilingual, creators probably wouldn't use a new language as an opportunity to write in elements that weren't originally there. But does that mean they would translate each existing word literally, no matter the context? Fans may say they don't like dubs putting radically different sounds or words in a character's mouth, but what it's really about is a different brain being put in their bodies. Portraying mindset to bring characters to life is the point of acting and writing in basically any field.
Did that feel like a cartoon? I'm so flattered!
It's just that when you're dubbing something into a new language, there needs to be an understanding that the characters and stories have already been brought to life. What a character says and how they say it are part of the same package, so writing isn't the only way to potentially diverge from the original work. Ico Incarnation's first English dub had dialogue that was nigh identical to the official subs, but can we still say it's giving us an accurate experience if the acting and directing are this bad?
Oh! Thank you for the... Buzz off! You're gonna make my food go bad.
Why, you...
What the? Like, so bad that Netflix eventually replaced it with a new one?
Oh, excuses! That's a rotten excuse!
The goal should be to bring those same characters and stories to life, and an unquestioning adherence to a direct translation doesn't always do that. Yu-Gi-Oh! Tried that with its uncut dub that only lasted 9 episodes, and talk about swinging too hard to the other extreme.
I'm skilled enough to take first in the National Duel Monsters Championship.
Just because you saw through one of my tricks doesn't mean you can beat me in a duel.
I don't think many people would say no to an uncut dub of Yu-Gi-Oh!, but this?
You must have cheated!
Never.
This ain't it.
Then from now on, every time I see beautiful mountains like this, or a beautiful horizon, every time I see beautiful scenery like we're seeing here, it will only remind me that I was a coward, that I ran away. Are you sure I really said corny stuff like that?
To respect the creative intent of a story means both knowing how some parts shouldn't be changed, but also how other parts should for a new language. If a character says a naturally constructed sentence in Japanese, identical word choice won't create a proper understanding if the inflection and phrasing doesn't feel the same. Even subtitlers will alter dialogue so that it sounds equally natural in English as it did in Japanese. But arguably this applies to an even greater extent to dubs, since the writing for dialogue is spoken aloud and needs to stand on its own. For example, if we're trying to stay close to the original Japanese version, what happens when the original Japanese versions have characters break out into English for the sake of humor?
I am mad scientist.
Oh my goodness!
It's so cool!
Not all English has this comedic intent behind it, but when the language switch itself is the joke, repeating the same English words in the dub sometimes misses the point of that joke.
I wish I were a bird.
Maybe this is why some writers try writing new English dialogue that achieves the same punchline on its own.
Son of a bitch! You motherfucker! Oh yeah, you motherfucker! Take this, you little prickhole! Eat dildo, motherfucker! Like that, don't you, motherfucker?
Or inverting the conceit itself.
Shut up! Urusai!
Direct translations don't always sound natural when read aloud. Lip flaps, visual energy, and general timing need to be worked around for the sake of general believability, and sometimes context needs to be made more concise for the sake of viewers that might not have the same predisposed understanding of Japanese tropes or linguistic tendencies. And it's that last part in particular that can still be an issue.
I was doing some reading about this idea that if you immerse yourself into a foreign language, that you can actually rewire your brain.
It's the theory that the language you speak determines how you think. And
yeah, it affects how you see everything. It was.
Creators from all over the world end up using the inner workings of their own language and culture as part of their stories, and those from Japan are no exception. Some may argue that dubs are only immersive for anime that bear Western influence already, but even those stories can still hold Japanese elements at their core.
The turtle took him to Ryogujo, the dragon temple.
Ryogujo?
That's right. It was like a palace, and they gave him a big welcoming party. Beautiful women, scrumptious feasts, breams and halibut swimming around. The days passed, and before he knew it, the time came to go back. And as a keepsake, he was given the tamate bako.
Tamate bako? Is that scrumptious too?
No, it's not food. It's a big chest with a treasure inside. He spent his time there as if in a dream.
I'm just watching a bad dream I never wake up from.
It can get to the point where the very etymology of a word can be an important plot detail. And with how complex Japanese role languages can get, perhaps hearing characters respond to specific norms in any different language might be seen as immersion breaking on principle, since genuine equivalents don't always exist.
What the hell kind of crap are you spouting over here, boy? It's okay for a fool to stay a fool, huh? Listen! Every single word contains its own soul! If you don't know the letters that communicate that soul, you're the one who loses out! That's why I'll never forgive the Japanese!
At the start of the Himoto Umaru-chan dub, Taihei calls his sister a dried fish.
My lazy, good-for-nothing, dried fish of a sister.
Which sounds oddly specific in English. However, it does come with a translator note that he's referring specifically to Himo no Onna. On one hand, this script decision hinges on the translator note to make sense, but on the other, it's kinda hard to avoid considering the name of the show itself is Himoto Umaru-chan, a portmanteau of Himo no Onna and Imoto. It's very rare for dubs to involve on-screen translations for anything other than on-screen Japanese writing. Things like nicknames are usually adapted in more natural-sounding ways, and instances like this can demonstrate how even keeping all the content intact can still feel unnatural for dubs. Especially when the actor delivers a Japanese idiom in English, the translator note explains it, but the pun based on it is still delivered aloud in Japanese. It makes more sense for a sub to take this route, since it's giving context to audible dialogue that already exists, and is using on-screen text anyway, but for a dub to do this could break the immersion. One benefit of watching dubs is avoiding the temporal clash inherent to associating text with audio in real time. Some subbed anime still have these for the sake of explaining a joke or reference, but it appears to happen far more selectively compared to the heyday of online fan subbing. Back then, its liberal usage notified viewers of every conceivable kind of cultural subtlety and literal definition. If it didn't have an exact, direct English counterpart, it was apparently worth leaving untranslated, or even explaining mid-episode. Not all groups did this to the same extent, and we're not necessarily implying this is what all fans actually want, but just as there's an audience for English dubs, there's also an audience for one-to-one literal scripts. This question of authenticity is still relevant to modern uncut dubs, since they attempt to avoid the pitfalls of hack dubs. If we're taking such a hard stance against altering visuals and music, why should dialogue content be any different, one might say. But then, how far exactly should or shouldn't they go? Sometimes things like honorifics can be plot relevant, so should they be included for dubs? Some famous dubs use them, and sometimes false equivalents can sound weirder anyway.
That's Mr. Kaneda to you, punk! Hey, call me Mr. P!
Was it right for the Dragon Pilot dub to leave Miko untranslated? Was Gurren Lagann wrong for adapting Aniki as Bro, or was Backstreet Girls wrong for leaving it in Japanese? Should Trigun have had Millie called Meryl Senpai in the dub as well as the sub? Should dub characters be saying words like tsundere aloud? Speaking of which, should characters call their siblings brother or sister aloud, despite the fact that English speakers rarely call their siblings by their familial relationship in real life? If censorship imposes one set of standards over another, doesn't the act of bringing anime to the West involve imposing the standards of the English language over Japanese? The way certain languages construct sentences and words in the first place has specific cultural nuance that gets lost by trying to understand it with a different language's grammar, even with subtitles. A simple you on its own doesn't specify the nuance of kimi, omae, teme, anta, anata, otaku, kisama, and so on. Even if there are ways to write around it, isn't there technically intention in how the meaning is specifically packaged?
Fuck you, Sasuke! You are my nakama!
Localization should capture the intent of the story, but if the Japanese creators build their story with the intent of it being aimed at a Japanese audience, does that mean the way for us foreigners to watch anime as it was truly intended is to not watch it at all?
Hey, so do you watch anime dubs?
No, I would never.
Ah, okay, I get it. You're more of a subtitle guy.
No! Why would we ever try to see Japanese animation as anything other than what it truly is?
Okay, so then you don't watch anime?
You know what? I respect Japanese culture. I love Japanese culture. I respect it so much that I completely stay away from it.
It's interesting, because in the booklet that came with Fooly Cooley's first American DVD release, its ADR director and script adapter Mark Handler actually predicted that English dubs would include Japanese cultural elements more as anime became more accepted in the West. This was one of the only dubs he worked on where characters would have random little bits of Japanese.
Hey, I'm stuck on this thing.
He even thought it would be great for dubs to have characters saying, eh? With that same rising inflection a Seiyu would use, and that Fooly Cooley would set a precedent through normalizing these kinds of aspects. Maybe this is exactly what some fans would want to be the norm, dubs that aren't restrained from espousing the Japanese roots of anime at all. Regardless, it's been over 15 years since Fooly Cooley debuted in English, and for better or worse, explicit elements like those aren't exactly front and center. However, this doesn't always mean that modern ADR staff don't value them, as they can still inform the adaptive process itself. Though, perhaps it'd be best if someone responsible for adapting such elements explained the process.
Hi, I'm Marissa Lenti. I've been involved with ADR on various levels over the years and was the adaptive scriptwriter for the 2018 Yuri series Bloom Into You. In episode 7, the two leads reach a turning point in their relationship, and in the Japanese version, Toko wishes for the two to start referring to each other by their first names, which in Japan is uncommon outside family, lovers, or exceptionally close friends.
You, 体育委員の名簿ってどこだっけ? You, 名前で呼んだ? 今.
This is also why most people in Japanese media refer to each other primarily by their surname, and some English dubs even follow suit with this.
Haruhi.
Nobody gave you permission to call me by my first name.
However, in the West, this practice isn't quite the same.
And what are you doing down here, Weasley?
Mind your attitude, Malfoy.
Outside some contexts, it's pretty much normal for people to call each other by first name regardless of relationship status. Bloom Into You was a simuldub, or dubcast as High Dive calls them, so at the time I began writing the English scripts for it, we didn't have access to episode 7. I knew that this element became important in the manga from the research I did on the title, but there was no guarantee what this scene would look like or how it would play out in the anime adaptation.
Are you and Koyomi good friends?
Well, I've known her since middle school, and since she's into literature, she comes by my family's store all the time.
Since the choice was made to have the characters use first names, like most all English speakers do, it'd be difficult for this specific exchange to carry the same emotional weight it did in the original. So, to keep this context intact, we had the two characters referring to each other with affectionate nicknames.
Maybe honey? If that's going to be your reaction every time, I definitely can't call you that.
Then, just call me by my name, but sweetly?
Toko. Toko?
Yeah?
Toko, darling.
On one hand, this is a way of getting the context of the original across in a way that goes beyond superficial details. But again, where's the line between making intent comprehensible and watering it down? Hypothetically, Westerners at large may reach a level of cultural sophistication where things like Japanese honorifics and naming conventions would be totally common knowledge, even outside of anime and manga fans who may already know. At the very least, expectations have already changed from the time when big producers thought anime needed to be dressed up as Western cartoons to succeed. So who's to say things won't change to the point where we might look back on certain adaptation decisions as incorrect or unnecessary? Inevitably, intention isn't always enough.
I think I came up with one solid reasoning that will probably wrap up all of my opinions on English dubbed anime.
Cultural significance. You see, anime is made in Japan by Japanese people. What that means is that there are many things that you will see in anime and hear in anime that will inevitably be lost in translation.
Wait, hold on a sec.
There are a number of English dubbed anime that I actually really like Cowboy Bebop, Fully Cooley, Penny and Stocking.
We've done a whole video celebrating Fully Cooley's dub, but praising it while advocating the importance of cultural significance in anime is admittedly a little inconsistent, since the show's handling of that significance itself can be seen as inconsistent. The script was very faithfully adapted, even to the point of keeping the honorifics, onomatopoeia, and short interjections untranslated, while many of the characters sounded almost identical to their Japanese voices. But it also replaced a lot of the pop culture references, products, and even puns with Western alternatives. Apparently there was approval given by the Japanese side to make these changes, since they wanted to preserve the meaning behind these references, which again is an example of changing content to keep context intact. But even when changes are sanctified by the original creators, do their desires necessarily override the desires of non-Japanese fans to know what the content is before it gets altered?
What does footy mean anyway?
It's hard to blame the staff of a 2003 dub for not foreseeing how the internet would eventually open up the general fandom's awareness of Japanese culture, but I'm not sure if this is how a dub would handle these kinds of situations nowadays.
Setting the parameters. That's really the hard part.
Yet, despite inconsistencies, the team's dedication to producing a style and flavor specific to this crazy narrative led to something that couldn't be compared to many other English dubs, or arguably American prelay cartoons.
What do you see in that grade school kid? What's he got that I haven't got? Coolie!
After all these years, the sequel series Progressive and Alternative still made a point out of including some of these same traits, almost like trademarks of the series. Of course, not every show is like Fully Cooley, in fact very few are. So while the underlying ethos is definitely there, the more specific decisions made for this dub can't necessarily be treated as a formula for success in other shows. The more direct imitation of the seiyu's sound was appropriate, due to how said seiyu were cast with the sound of their voice being a higher priority than their acting ability. And despite unadapted elements of Japanese speech conflicting with the adapted cultural references, Fully Cooley was already a story rife with self-aware fourth wall humor, feeling idiosyncratic inside and outside Japan. Granted, that probably wasn't the exact intention of the dub staff at the time, but it's still something very relevant to the craft itself. Not every anime is the same, not every ADR staff member or actor is the same, and not every anime fan is the same. Well, at least in theory. It's hard to deny that anime can be quite reiterative with its content in some areas, and dedicated fans probably already know what kinds of things they want from the medium. However, it's also hard to deny just how much variety there is to be found in anime, both in the stories they tell and how they tell them. It's only healthy to celebrate both common ground and diversity, so the way these stories get adapted shouldn't be wholly formulaic either.
You see, a good doll should be able to figure it out. The true meaning behind someone's words.
But what elements of a story, scene, or even individual line constitute the original spirit is going to be subjective. There can be so many different aspects that make up the broader context, not just word choice, but word order, rhythm, inflection, pitch, referential value, social register, and so on. Different writers or directors are going to prioritize and balance different aspects on different projects. And yes, it's not out of the question to sometimes get staff who either miss the point of what they're working on, or misunderstand their role. Unfortunately, occurrences like these are byproducts of this being an industry. The reality that not every title will be handled by the ideal team, or even when it is, that they won't always have the ideal circumstances. Something that certainly isn't exclusive to the English dubbing of anime.
I find your lack of faith disturbing.
Personally, we think there's a difference between altering a punchline yet maintaining its function,
I've got some really big shoes to fill.
She noticed him!
and adding a punchline to a scene that had no joke to begin with.
Now then, it's time for me to make the donuts.
And changes that work amazingly in one series
Fucking fucking fuck fucking fuck 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 fucking 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 fuck fucking.
might not be so appropriate in every series.
What the fuck?
For such a context-sensitive language, adaptation can play a part in communicating those nuances, even if the way they're communicated can come off as inconsistent depending on the show and the people working on it.
Empathy? I'm saying I love you.
Your Grace?
I'm saying I like you.
What could sound awkward or watered down to some might be a step in the right direction for others. However, this is something that fans and creators alike should at least be allowed to have opinions on, even clashing opinions, and to be able to discuss possibilities without immediate dismissal. After all, context is important.
It might be difficult to keep up with subtitles, it might be difficult to read on the screen, but trust me that you will get the best fucking experience, and you get to learn a different language that you otherwise probably will never hear.
If someone wants an experience comparable to a Japanese viewer, well, the Japanese usually don't watch anime to learn a language or culture they live day to day, unless learning is the purpose of the show. Then again, any kind of localized or adapted viewing experience is going to differ from that of a local Japanese viewer, to whom most of these aspects is second nature. So while there is value in the unintended learning aspect of watching anime as a foreigner, we need to remember that it is unintended. And I think the priority for learning should come from the viewer themselves, not the adaptive staff who have been tasked to bring the narrative into a new language. Sometimes that will entail keeping a literal translation untouched to strengthen the original context.
Yuki means snow, doesn't it?
But that's different from using the anime as a platform for demonstrating how certain words could work in contexts outside the story. Subbed anime makes learning more accessible through basic word association, but again, if the original creators were bilingual, how much would they care about our individual efforts to discover the language and culture?
All things change in a dynamic environment. Your effort to remain what you are is what limits you.
Whatever your answer is, it's still presumptuous for us to deny that Japanese viewers also have autonomous interpretations. They may share a cultural background, but just like everyone else in the world, they are human beings with their own individual perspectives, which of course affects how they create and interact with art. Interpretation itself is part of the experience. That's why we consume works in our own language too.
Vincent is this guy who he can't tell reality from fantasy, so he refers to himself throughout the movie as being in purgatory. And by purgatory, he's explicit, he makes it clear, he means this earth. It's a running theme.
Where those who were left behind, unable to get into heaven, continue to suffer. The world that we're in now.
Then when he has Faye tied up on the floor in this wonderful, demented scene, he asks her to come with him. And then he says, okay, I'm leaving and I'm going to leave you here. And what he says is, you can watch Purgatory. In Japanese, you leave out a lot of the words. The personal pronouns and all kinds of things that we include in a sentence, they leave out and they imply them. And I had two completely different translations of it from different Japanese speakers. One of them said, you can watch from your own personal purgatory. And the other one, he says, you can stay here alone and watch what's going to happen to this purgatory. It's two completely different meanings of the line. And we sat here at a conference table at Sony with the group of executives from 3 different companies discussing this, and the Japanese speakers themselves disagreed on which one is correct. It's a lesson in this whole issue of direct translations. There's really no such thing as a direct translation. Even in the original language, people interpret a line in different ways. And so when we're trying to interpret it, it's a problem and it's a challenge. In a lot of cases, there are no simple answers to it.
I'll be at the bridge that links Earth to the heavens. You can stay here alone and watch what happens to this purgatory.
The idea of not taking things totally literally is going to involve change, and change can be indicative of censorship. However, I worry that people are simplifying what dubbing can actually be capable of if they always associate it with censorship. It's It's apparent just how serious preserving artistic and cultural intent is to some people given all the growing pains over the years. And although there will definitely be changes worth condemning in the future, it's disingenuous to use those cases to condemn the concept of change itself, as dubs that play it too safe can misrepresent the original in a different way. Some fans do understand the necessity of change for the sake of adaptation, while also being conscious of how certain decisions stray into censorship. However, it seems rather insincere to assume that everyone engaging with this conversation has the same level of awareness. This isn't just a sub versus dub thing either, as even within those niches not everyone's going to be on the same page. Beneficial or detrimental, the desire to change something doesn't always come from the same place. Hardcore or casual, not everybody watches anime for the same things. And just how every title isn't for everyone, not all English dubs are gonna please everyone. And that's all the more reason why discussion on such broad topics is so important. Appropriate criticism will continue to be what helps us go from this
Allied to good, nightmare to you,
to this.
I am the Super Saiyan Son Goku!
Now more than ever, people working in localization need to be aware that what makes an anime work in Japan can make it work the world over. But actually making that succeed requires an active respect for the original, not a passive one. Whatever that means to a specific show, a specific scene, a specific line, or a specific staff, it'll come from a dedication to the narrative's deeper strengths, not tone-deaf sanitization, nor tone-deaf literalism. We've evolved past those being the standard, so we think it's only natural that the standard for discussion should follow suit. And on that note, let's keep the discussion going down below. Big thanks to Jake Young and Marissa Lenti for sharing their insight and experience with us, as well as Giguk and CDog VA for lending their vocal performances, and Ahoba for the additional Japanese consultation. Links all in the description. And just to clarify, we don't have anything against Joey the Anime Man. We just disagree with the video he made, that's all. Special thanks to all our patrons for helping make these videos possible, including Reagan Carriere, Ryan Rodriguez, Seth Phillips, Marissa Lenti, Brandon, JR Pictures, Unknown Secret 1000, and everyone else currently supporting us. This has been the Cartoon Cipher, and until next time.